3 times that week, Kim Min-jun had dismantled a person's world with the same clinical precision he used to hostilely take over a tech firm. The first was a high-profile influencer who had spent 3 months orchestrating a chance encounter at his private club. She had leaned in, smelling a $500 an ounce perfume, and whispered a proposition that would have brought any other man to his knees. Min-jun hadn't even looked up from his tablet. He simply signaled his security team. "She's distracting," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. She was blacklisted from the venue before her heels hit the sidewalk. The second was the daughter of a rival real estate mogul, a woman whose marriage to him would have merged the 2 most powerful portfolios in Seoul. She had approached him at a charity gala, eyes bright with the hope of a power couple future. Min-jun listened to her proposal for 5 minutes, watching her lips move the way one watches a fish behind glass, observing the movement but feeling none of the water. When she finished, he adjusted his cufflinks. "You are an excellent asset, Jisoo," he said, "but I don't invest in assets that require emotional maintenance." He walked away before the first tear could track through her foundation. The third was his own personal assistant of 4 years, a woman who knew his coffee order, his blood type, and his darkest secrets. She had cornered him in the back of his Maybach, her voice trembling as she confessed that she had stayed silent out of loyalty, but could no longer ignore the way her heart skipped when he entered a room. Min-jun didn't flinch. He didn't even offer a polite smile. He looked at her, really looked at her, noticing the way her pulse jumped in her neck. It was a biological fact, a technical data point, but it moved him no more than a flickering light bulb. "Hand in your resignation to HR by morning," he said. "You've compromised your utility." He sat in the silence of the car afterward, waiting for a spark of regret or a twinge of guilt. Nothing. His chest was a vault that had lost its combination decades ago. In 34 years, Kim Min-jun had never understood the concept of want. He understood acquisition. He understood dominance. He understood the white dragon legacy he had been born to lead. But that jagged, desperate pull toward another human being, to him it was a myth, a story told by the weak to justify their lack of control. He accepted his coldness as a fundamental law of physics. So when exactly 48 hours after firing his assistant, Kim Min-jun stood in the center of an architectural firm and felt the air leave his lungs, the world didn't just tilt, it shattered. He wasn't there to scout a talent, he was there to buy a building. But then he saw Ebony Johnson. She was standing over a blueprint, her hair in a sharp bun, her skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights like deep polished mahogany. She wasn't looking for him. She wasn't trying to please him. She was simply existing. And for the first time in his life, the mind circuit in Min-jun's brain didn't just flicker, it surged with enough voltage to burn him alive. Every employee in the room stopped. They felt the temperature drop, then rise. They saw the man of stone take 3 deliberate steps toward her, his intense gaze fixed on her like a predator who had finally found a worthy prize. He didn't offer a business card. He didn't mention his billions. He simply looked at her and asked for the one thing he had never requested, her time. The office held its breath, waiting for the inevitable surrender that followed Kim Min-jun everywhere. Instead, Ebony Johnson didn't even look up from her blueprints. "I don't work for men who think their shadow is a gift," she said, her voice cool and steady. "So the answer is no." Min-jun stood in the middle of the busy office, but for him, the room had gone silent. He was a man who lived by numbers, blueprints, and cold facts. He could look at a skyscraper and tell you exactly where the weak points were. He could look at a person and know exactly what they wanted in exchange for their loyalty. But as he looked at Ebony Johnson, his usual tricks failed him. She didn't look up when he approached. She was leaning over a large table covered in drawings of a new building. Her fingers held a pencil with a steady grip, and her eyes were narrowed in deep focus. Most people would have jumped to their feet the moment a man of his status walked in. They would have straightened their ties or smoothed their hair, desperate for his approval. Ebony did none of that. She simply continued her work, her mind clearly miles away from the billionaire standing 3 feet from her. Min-jun felt a strange, sharp pull in his chest. It was uncomfortable and new. He had spent his entire life building walls around his heart, making himself a fortress that no one could enter. Yet, just by standing there and ignoring him, this woman had found a crack in his armor. He studied the way the light hit her face. He noticed the strength in her shoulders and the calm way she breathed. To him, she was a masterpiece, not a painting to be bought and hung on a wall, but a living, breathing structure that demanded respect. "I am Kim Min-jun," he said. He expected her to be impressed. He expected her to turn around with a look of surprise. Instead, she finally looked up, and her eyes were as hard as diamonds. She didn't look at his expensive suit or his powerful face. She looked through him, as if he were just another person blocking her light. "I know who you are," she replied. Her voice was smooth and firm. "You're the man who thinks money is a substitute for character. You think you can buy this firm just to own the people inside it." Min-jun felt his pride sting. He was the architect of shadows, the man who controlled the city's skyline and its dark secrets. No one spoke to him this way. He took a step closer, trying to regain his dominance, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze never wavering. At that moment, Min-jun realized something that terrified him. He had spent his life tearing down obstacles and buying whatever he desired. But Ebony was a different kind of structure. She was built on a foundation of integrity and self-worth that his money couldn't touch. She was the one thing in the world he couldn't own, and that made him want her more than anything he had ever acquired before. He watched her return to her blueprints, dismissed like a common worker. As he walked out of the office, his mind was already spinning. He had come to buy a building, but he was leaving with a mission. He would find a way into her world, even if he had to change everything he knew to do it. The word no was not something Min-jun heard often. In his world, people said yes before he even finished asking the question. They said yes because they feared him, or they said yes because they wanted his money. But as he walked toward his waiting car, the sound of Ebony's voice kept playing in his head. It was steady, it was calm, it was a complete rejection of everything he represented. He sat in the back of the black sedan and watched the city lights blur past the window. Usually, he would be checking stocks or sending emails to his syndicate leaders. Tonight, his hand stayed still on his lap. He kept thinking about the way she hadn't even blinked when he told her his name. To her, he wasn't a powerful billionaire or a feared boss. He was just a man with a hollow soul, and that thought burned like ice in his veins. By the time he reached his penthouse, the sting of the rejection had turned into something else. It wasn't just anger, it was a deep, hungry curiosity. He went to his large desk and opened a slim laptop. With a few clicks, he began to dig. He didn't want to buy her firm anymore. He wanted to understand how someone could be so strong. He looked at her past projects and her school records. Every detail showed a woman who worked hard and never took the easy path. He found himself staring at a photo of her from a news article about a new park she had designed. She was smiling, but it wasn't a fake smile for the cameras. It was real. Min-jun realized that he had spent his whole life collecting things that had a price. Ebony, however, was priceless. She was the only person who had ever looked at him and seen exactly what was missing. He stayed up until the sun began to rise over the city skyline. He knew he should let it go. A smart man would find another architect and move on, but Min-jun had never been a man who walked away from a challenge. The more she pushed him away, the more he felt a pull toward her. It was becoming a dangerous game. He wasn't just interested in her work anymore. He was obsessed with the idea of making her look at him and see a man she could finally respect. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing her sharp gaze. He knew he couldn't just walk back into her office and ask again. He needed a new plan. He needed a way to be in her life every single day until she had no choice but to notice him. If he couldn't have her as his architect, he would find another way to bind their lives together. The no she had given him wasn't the end of the story. For Min-jun, it was only the beginning of a very dark and complicated chase. Min-jun did not believe in coincidences. He believed in strategy. After days of watching from the shadows, he found the perfect opening. It wasn't at a fancy gala or a high-end office. It was at a small, quiet bakery 3 blocks away from Ebony's apartment. This was where her sister, Sierra, worked. Min-jun stood across the street, watching the younger woman through the glass. She was different from Ebony. While Ebony was like a sharp, cold diamond, Sierra was like soft, warm light. She smiled at every customer and moved with a gentle kindness that seemed out of place in this harsh city. He straightened his black suit and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang, and the sweet smell of sugar and bread filled the air. Sierra looked up, and for a second she seemed frozen. Min-jun knew why. He looked like a man who belonged in a boardroom, not a neighborhood bake shop. But he didn't use his boss voice today. He softened his eyes and offered a polite, practiced smile. "I'll have whatever you recommend," he said quietly. Sierra's face turned pink as she busily packed a box of pastries. She was shy, and unlike her sister, she was easily impressed by the way he carried himself. As they talked for a few minutes, Min-jun realized something very important. Sierra didn't just love her sister, she looked up to her. Ebony was her hero and her protector. If he could win the trust of this gentle girl, Ebony would be forced to let him back into her world. He could see the blueprint of a new plan forming in his mind. Sierra wasn't just a girl behind a counter. She was the key to the only door that had ever been locked in his face. As he left the shop with a box he didn't intend to eat, he felt a surge of power. He had found the weak point in Ebony's wall. She would never open the door for a billionaire, but she would always open it for her sister. He watched Sierra through the window one last time as she waved goodbye. She was innocent and sweet, and a small part of him felt a tiny sting of guilt for using her this way. But that part was quickly silenced by his need to win. By the time he reached his car, his decision was made. He wouldn't chase Ebony through her work or her firm. He would weave himself into her family. He would become someone Sierra relied on, someone she trusted so much that Ebony would have no choice but to sit across the table from him. He drove away, the city lights reflecting off the hood of his car like a predatory eye. The game was no longer just about a rejection. It was about how far he was willing to go to turn a no into a yes. The city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows were bright, but the mood inside the penthouse was heavy. Min-jun stood in the center of the room, his black suit looking sharp against the modern furniture. He had spent weeks carefully moving his pieces into place. He visited the bakery every day. He had sent flowers to Sierra and helped her with her small problems. To Sierra, he was a prince. To Ebony, who stood by the glass window with her arms crossed, he was a shadow she couldn't shake. Ebony's eyes were narrowed as she watched him. She still didn't trust him, and she hadn't forgotten the day she told him no in her office. She had tried to warn Sierra, but her sister only saw the kindness Min-jun pretended to have. Tonight, Min-jun had invited them both over, claiming he had something important to share. The air was thick with a tension that only he and Ebony understood. "Sierra," Min-jun said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. He turned away from Ebony and looked directly at the younger sister. Sierra stepped forward, her eyes wide and full of hope. She looked beautiful in her simple black dress, but she looked even more vulnerable. Min-jun reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The click of the box opening sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside, a diamond sparkled under the warm interior lights, reflecting the wealth and power of the man holding it. Ebony's face went pale. She took a step toward them, her hand reaching out as if to stop time itself. "Min-jun, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of shock and fear. He didn't look at her. He didn't give her the satisfaction of a glance. Instead, he slowly dropped to one knee in front of Sierra. It was the ultimate move in his game. He was binding himself to this family in a way that Ebony could never undo. "Sierra Johnson," he said, his expression calm and controlled. "You are the light I didn't know I needed. Will you marry me?" Sierra let out a small sob and covered her mouth with her hands. Tears began to run down her cheeks, tears of pure joy. She couldn't see the coldness in his eyes or the way his posture remained stiff and calculated. She only saw the man she thought loved her. Across the room, Ebony felt like the floor was falling away. She watched in horror as her sister whispered yes and pulled Min-jun up for a hug. Ebony realized then that she was trapped. If she told Sierra the truth now, she would break her sister's heart. If she stayed silent, she would have to watch the man who obsessed over her become her brother-in-law. Min-jun finally looked over Sierra's shoulder, his dark eyes meeting Ebony's. There was no love in that look, only the silent, victorious glint of a man who had finally found a way to win. The dining table was long, made of dark glass that looked like a deep pool of water. It sat in the middle of the penthouse, reflecting the city lights from the windows. Min-jun sat at the head of the table, looking every bit like a king in his own castle. To his right was Sierra, whose face was glowing with a happiness that seemed too bright for the room. Across from them sat Ebony. She hadn't touched her food. Her eyes were fixed on Min-jun with a look that could have cut through steel. Min-jun reached over and placed his hand on top of Sierra's. It was a simple, romantic move, but he made sure to do it while looking directly at Ebony. He saw the way Ebony's jaw tightened. He felt the victory in the air. "Sierra tells me you've been working late on the museum project, Ebony," Min-jun said. His voice was smooth and polite, the perfect tone for a future brother-in-law. "It's important work. A building needs a strong foundation to survive, don't you think?" Ebony gripped her silver fork until her knuckles turned white. She knew exactly what he was saying. He was telling her that he had built a foundation in her family, and there was nothing she could do to tear it down. "A building also needs to be honest," Ebony replied, her voice low and steady. "If the materials are rotten or hidden in shadows, the whole thing will eventually fall." Sierra looked between them, a small, confused smile on her lips. "You two are so serious," she laughed, placing her hand over Min-jun's. "Min-jun has been so helpful, Ebony. He even offered to help me find a better location for the bakery. Isn't he wonderful?" Min-jun smiled, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "I only want what is best for this family, Sierra. Now that we are going to be joined together, your dreams are my dreams." He picked up his wine glass and offered a silent toast toward Ebony. It was a psychological war, fought with soft words and sharp glances. Every time he complimented Sierra, he was actually striking at Ebony's heart. Every time he talked about their future wedding, he was reminding Ebony that he had won. He was the devil at their table, wearing a luxury suit and offering gifts, and Ebony was the only one who could see his true face. As the meal went on, the tension grew until the air felt heavy. Min-jun watched Ebony struggle to stay calm for her sister's sake. He enjoyed the way she had to bite her tongue. She was a woman who loved the truth, yet he had forced her to live a lie. By the time the plates were cleared, Min-jun knew he had achieved exactly what he wanted. He wasn't just a man she had rejected anymore. He was a permanent part of her life, a shadow she had to eat with, talk to, and pretend to love. As he stood up to walk them to the door, his reflection in the glass table looked cold and victorious. The war was far from over, but in this house, the devil was already winning. The dinner had left a bitter taste in Ebony's mouth that no amount of water could wash away. A few nights later, she found herself back at Min-jun's penthouse. Sierra had forgotten her designer handbag there after their last visit, and she had begged Ebony to stop by and grab it on her way home from the office. Ebony didn't want to go, but she couldn't say no to her sister. The penthouse was quiet when she arrived. The maid let her in, mentioning that Min-jun was in a private meeting in the lower lounge and shouldn't be disturbed. Ebony walked toward the guest closet where Sierra usually left her things, but as she passed the heavy oak doors of Min-jun's private study, she noticed they were slightly open. A cold breeze seemed to blow out from the room. She knew she should keep walking, but something pulled her inside. The room smelled of expensive leather and old cigars. It was a man's room, built for secrets. As she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something on the thick carpet. She looked down and saw a pair of silver cufflinks lying near the edge of the desk. They were beautiful, but as she picked them up, her heart stopped. There was a dark, dried smear across the silver. It wasn't ink or wine. Having grown up in a rough neighborhood before she became a successful architect, Ebony knew exactly what dried blood looked like. Her hands began to shake. She looked at the desk and saw a small, crumpled piece of paper that had been missed by the trash can. She smoothed it out. It wasn't a business memo. It was a list of names with addresses, and 3 of them had been crossed out with a heavy red line. At the top of the page was a small hand-drawn symbol, a white dragon. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Min-jun wasn't just a cold billionaire who liked to control people with his wealth. He was something much worse. The White Dragon was a name whispered in the shadows of the city, a syndicate that dealt in fear and violence. He wasn't just playing a game with her heart. He was a man who lived a life of blood and crime. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The heavy, rhythmic stride belonged to only one person. Ebony quickly put the cufflinks back and shoved the paper into her pocket. She ducked out of the study just as Min-jun turned the corner. He stopped, his eyes scanning her face with terrifying intensity. He looked at her hands, then at her eyes, searching for any sign of what she had found. "You're late, Ebony," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous tone. "I didn't think you liked spending time in my home." Ebony forced herself to breathe. She clutched Sierra's bag to her chest, her fingers feeling the crumpled paper in her pocket. For the first time, she wasn't just angry at him. She was truly afraid. He wasn't just a man she had rejected. He was a predator who had brought her innocent sister into a world of shadows. As she hurried toward the elevator, she realized the stakes had changed. This wasn't a war of words anymore. It was a fight for survival. Rain lashed against the windows of the penthouse, matching the storm brewing in Min-jun's life. He stumbled through the door late that night, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had managed to keep his suit jacket on, but beneath the expensive fabric, his white shirt was ruined. A jagged cut across his side was bleeding freely, the result of a dark alley meeting gone wrong. He was the White Dragon, a man who was supposed to be untouchable, but tonight he felt entirely human and dangerously weak. He made it as far as the velvet couch before his legs gave out. He didn't want to call his private doctor. He didn't want anyone in the syndicate to know he was hurt. Just as he closed his eyes, hoping the world would stop spinning, he heard the soft click of heels on the hardwood floor. "Min-jun? Is that you?" It was Sierra. She had stayed late to decorate the apartment for their engagement party. When she saw him slumped against the furniture, she didn't scream or run away in fear. Instead, she dropped her bags and rushed to his side. She saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt and gasped, but her hands remained steady. "You're hurt," she whispered. She didn't ask how it happened. She didn't demand to know why a billionaire was bleeding like a street fighter. She simply helped him pull off his jacket and began to work. Sierra hurried to the kitchen and returned with a bowl of warm water and clean cloths. She knelt on the floor beside him, her face full of a kindness that Min-jun didn't understand. He watched her through blurry eyes. He had spent weeks using her as a pawn, a way to get close to Ebony, yet here she was, treating him like he was the most precious thing in the world. As she gently cleaned the wound, her touch was light and filled with genuine mercy. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, more to herself than to him. She looked up and smiled, a small, sad smile that reached her eyes. In that moment, Min-jun felt a different kind of pain, a sharp sting of guilt. He looked at her and realized she was completely innocent. She saw a hero where there was only a monster. He had expected to feel powerful by controlling her, but her pure goodness made him feel small and ashamed. Ebony walked in just as Sierra was finishing the bandage. She froze at the doorway, her eyes darting from the blood on the floor to the silver cufflinks on the table and then to Min-jun's pale face. She saw her sister's hands covered in the evidence of his violent life. Ebony's face was full of horror, but Sierra just looked up and said, "Ebony, help me, he's hurt." Min-jun locked eyes with Ebony over Sierra's shoulder. He was at his weakest, trapped by his own lies, and physically broken. He saw the fire in Ebony's gaze, the way she wanted to scream the truth and pull her sister away from him. But as Sierra leaned his head back against a pillow and stroked his hair, the monster felt a flicker of something he had never known, the heavy weight of a mercy he didn't deserve. He was still the man who wanted to own Ebony, but for the first time, the foundation of his plan felt like it was crumbling under the weight of Sierra's kindness. Min-jun's recovery was fast, but his mood remained as dark as the city streets at midnight. Even though he was engaged to Sierra, his eyes never truly stopped following Ebony. He watched her from the tinted windows of his car, and he followed her schedule with a precision that bordered on madness. So, when a new man appeared in Ebony's life, Min-jun felt a heat in his blood that had nothing to do with his recent injury. The man was a wealthy developer named Lee Sang-uk. He was handsome, charming, and most importantly, he was clean. He didn't have blood on his cufflinks or a secret syndicate to lead. Min-jun watched through the window of a high-end restaurant as Sang-uk laughed at something Ebony said, leaning in close to touch her hand. In that moment, Min-jun didn't feel like a businessman or a fiancé. He felt like a predator whose territory had been invaded. His syndicate instincts, usually kept under tight control, flared up like a wildfire. To Min-jun, Ebony was the only structure he couldn't buy, and he would be damned if someone else managed to move in. He didn't wait for the dinner to end. He didn't play the long game. He placed a single phone call, and within minutes, the restaurant's owner, a man who owed the White Dragon everything, approached Sang-uk's table with a pale face. The next night, Min-jun cornered Sang-uk in a private parking garage. The billionaire stood in the shadows, his tailored black suit blending into the darkness. When Sang-uk saw him, he tried to act brave, but his voice shook. "I don't know who you think you are, but Ebony isn't interested in—" Min-jun didn't let him finish. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, pinning the man against a concrete pillar. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone was enough to suffocate the air in the room. "She is off limits," Min-jun whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "If you so much as breathe the same air as her again, I will make sure you lose everything, your money, your buildings, and your future. Do you understand?" He squeezed Sang-uk's throat just enough to see the fear take hold. It was a brutal display of power, a reminder that beneath the billionaire's charm lived a monster that would tear the world apart to keep what he wanted. He threw the man aside like a piece of trash and straightened his sleeves. As he drove away, Min-jun felt a strange sense of calm. He knew Ebony would hate him if she found out. He knew it proved everything she said about him being hollow and controlling. But as he looked at the ring on his own finger, the one that tied him to Sierra, he realized he didn't care about the rules anymore. He was the guardian of a secret he wasn't supposed to have, and he would use every bit of his dark power to make sure Ebony Johnson stayed exactly where he could see her. He was a jealous man, and in his world, jealous men never lost. The silence in the penthouse was thick and heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Sierra had been in the kitchen, humming softly as she cut flowers for the vases. She was happy, still living in the dream that Min-jun was the man she had always hoped for. But then she heard voices coming from the balcony, sharp, urgent voices that made her stop what she was doing. Min-jun and Ebony were standing outside, the city wind blowing between them. Min-jun's face was tense, his usual mask of calm starting to slip. Ebony was facing him, her eyes full of fire. She had reached her breaking point after seeing how he had scared away anyone who came near her. "You have to stop this, Min-jun," Ebony cried out. "You're hurting everyone. Why are you doing this to Sierra? She actually loves you. How can you live with yourself knowing you are lying to her every single day?" Min-jun let out a cold, sharp laugh that made Sierra's heart go still. "You know exactly why I'm doing it, Ebony. I didn't want a bakery girl. I didn't want a sweet, gentle life. I wanted you." He stepped closer to her, his shadow falling over her face. The engagement, the flowers, the kindness, it was all a ruse. It was a bridge to get back to you because you were the only person who ever dared to tell me no. Ebony backed away, her face full of disgust. "You used my sister like a pawn in a game. You are a monster, Min-jun." "Maybe I am," he replied, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "But it worked. I am in your life now. I am at your table, and I'm never leaving." Sierra stood behind the glass door, the world spinning around her. The flower shears slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a loud clang. The veil she had been living under was shredded in a single second. Everything she thought was real, the smiles, the shared coffee, the proposal, was nothing but a lie used to chase her sister. She pushed the door open, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears that wouldn't stop. Min-jun and Ebony both froze. For the first time, Min-jun looked truly panicked. He reached out a hand, but Sierra backed away as if his touch were poison. "Sierra, I can explain," Min-jun started, his voice cracking. "Explain what?" Sierra sobbed, her voice breaking the quiet night. "That I was just a tool? That you never cared about me at all?" She looked at Ebony, then back at the man she thought she loved. The heartbreak was so deep it felt like it was breaking the house itself. Sierra didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed her coat and ran toward the elevator, her cries echoing through the luxury apartment. Ebony turned to Min-jun, her eyes cold and full of hatred. "You finally got what you wanted, didn't you? You're in our lives, but now you've destroyed the only thing that was good in yours." She turned and followed her sister, leaving Min-jun alone in his dark, empty palace. The victory he had worked so hard for felt like ashes in his mouth. The silence that followed Sierra's departure was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that happens when a storm is about to break. Min-jun stayed on the balcony, watching the elevator lights go down. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest, a feeling he had never known before. He had spent his whole life being the hunter, but as he looked at the empty penthouse, he realized he had made himself a target. He didn't have time to process his thoughts. Suddenly, the lights in the penthouse flickered and died. The great glass windows, which usually showed the beautiful city skyline, now looked like black walls. Min-jun's syndicate instinct screamed at him. He reached for his phone, but the signal was dead. Someone had cut the wires. Someone had been waiting for the exact moment when his world was falling apart. A loud crash echoed from the front door. Men in dark tactical gear burst into the room, their movements fast and professional. They weren't his men. The symbol on their vests was a jagged red blade, the mark of the Jang family, his fiercest rivals. Min-jun moved to fight, his hands curling into fists, but a heavy blow to the back of his head sent him to his knees. Through the blur in his vision, he saw the elevator doors open again. Ebony was being dragged back into the room, her hands tied behind her back. Behind her, a man held Sierra by the arm. Sierra's face was red from crying, and her eyes were wide with terror. She looked at Min-jun, and even though she was heartbroken, her scream was full of fear for him. "The white dragon has grown soft," a voice hissed from the shadows. It was Jang Hae-won, the leader of the rival group. He stepped into the moonlight, a cruel smile on his face. "You were so busy playing house with these two that you forgot to watch your back. Now your empire belongs to me." Min-jun tried to stand, but a boot pressed him back down into the carpet. He watched in horror as the men began to push Ebony and Sierra toward the service exit. He had used these women to satisfy his own obsession, and now his dark life had caught up to them. Ebony looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked at him with a silent plea to save her sister. "Take them to the warehouse," Jang ordered. "If Min-jun wants them back, he'll have to crawl for them." As the room went completely dark again, Min-jun lay on the floor, listening to the fading sounds of Sierra's sobs and Ebony's struggle. He had wanted to own them, to control them, and to be a part of their lives. Now, because of his greed, they were captives in a war they never asked to join. The billionaire, the boss, the man of stone, he was none of those things anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything, and the only way to get it back was to become the monster he had promised to leave behind. Min-jun did not go to the police. He did not call his lawyers. Instead, he went to a secret room beneath his penthouse that even the maids didn't know existed. He stripped off his tailored luxury suit and put on a simple black tactical outfit. He checked his weapons with cold, steady hands. The man who had proposed with the diamond ring was gone. In his place was the white dragon, a man who had earned his throne through blood and fire. The warehouse was a skeleton of rusted steel and broken concrete on the edge of the docks. Min-jun arrived alone, but he moved like a whole army. He didn't sneak in. He blew the front doors off their hinges, the explosion lighting up the night sky. He stepped through the smoke, his eyes glowing with a terrifying primal light. Jang's men rushed him, but they were no match for a man who had nothing left to lose. Min-jun moved with a brutal speed that was hard to follow. He wasn't just defending himself, he was destroying everything in his path. He used his fists, his feet, and the shadows themselves to strike. Ebony and Sierra were tied to chairs in the center of the room. They watched in a mix of awe and pure horror. They had seen Min-jun as a billionaire and a fiancé, but they had never seen this side of him. This was the full monster. He didn't hesitate. He didn't show mercy. When one of the guards tried to point a gun at Ebony, Min-jun disarmed him so violently that Sierra had to look away. Jang Hae-won stepped out, holding a knife to Ebony's throat. "Stay back, dragon, or she dies." Min-jun stopped. He stood perfectly still, his chest heaving. His face was splattered with red, and his knuckles were raw. "You made a mistake, Jang," Min-jun said. His voice didn't sound like a human voice anymore. It sounded like a growl from the deep woods. You thought they were my weakness, but they are the only reason I kept the monster inside. Now that you've hurt them, there is no one left to protect me from you." Before Jang could even blink, Min-jun threw a hidden blade with perfect aim. It struck Jang's shoulder, forcing him to drop the knife and stumble back. Min-jun was on him in a second, his hands locking around the rival leader's throat. The rage in Min-jun's eyes was so dark that even Ebony felt a chill of fear. He looked like he was ready to end it right there. "Min-jun, stop!" Ebony's voice rang out through the warehouse. He froze. His fingers were tight, his muscles bulging. He looked at Ebony, then at the sobbing Sierra. He saw the terror in their eyes, not just terror of the situation, but terror of him. He realized then that by saving them this way, he was showing them the truth he had tried so hard to hide. He was a man of shadows, a creature of violence. He slowly let go of Jang and stepped back, his hands shaking. He had won the fight, but as he looked at the sisters, he knew he had truly unmasked the monster they could never forget. The warehouse was quiet now, except for the distant sound of police sirens. Min-jun stood in the center of the wreckage he had created. He looked at his hands, which were bruised and stained. Then he looked at Ebony and Sierra. They were safe, but they were looking at him like he was a stranger. He realized then that he could not go back to his old life. He could not keep the white dragon alive and ever hope to be worthy of the air they breathed. The next morning, Min-jun did something that shocked the entire city. He did not go to his office at the top of the skyscraper. Instead, he met with a high-level government investigator. He walked into the room and sat down, placing a small black drive on the table. It contained everything: the bank accounts, the names of the syndicate leaders, and the records of every illegal deal he had ever made. "I am giving you the white dragon," Min-jun said, his voice tired but clear. "In exchange, I want total protection for Ebony and Sierra Johnson. I want their names cleared of any connection to me." The investigator looked at the wealth of information. "You know what this means, don't you? You will lose everything: your buildings, your accounts, your status. You will be a man with nothing." Min-jun looked out the window at the skyline he had spent years building. For the first time, those tall towers didn't look like achievements. They looked like bars on a cage. "I have lived with everything for 34 years, he replied, "and I have never been more empty. I am ready to pay the price." Over the next few weeks, the fall of Kim Min-jun was the only story on the news. His luxury penthouse was seized. His expensive cars were towed away. His name was stripped from the buildings he owned. He moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city where no one knew his face. He traded his tailored black suits for simple jeans and t-shirts. He spent his days working to undo the damage his syndicate had caused. He used the last of his hidden legal savings to set up a fund for the families hurt by the Jang family and his own former associates. His bank account was nearly empty, and his power was completely gone. One evening, he sat on a small wooden chair in his new, quiet home. The room was plain, with no marble floors or velvet couches, but as he sat there, he felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't the cold, hard weight he was used to. It was a light, steady rhythm. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a predator or a boss. He felt like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. He had lost a fortune that could move mountains, but in the quiet of the night, he realized he had finally found his soul. 6 months had passed since the name Kim Min-jun had disappeared from the front pages of the newspapers. The city skyline was still there, glowing with millions of lights, but Min-jun no longer looked at the buildings and saw a kingdom. Instead, he looked at them and saw the people living inside, people with lives, fears, and dreams. He was working as a simple consultant for a low-cost housing project, using his knowledge of architecture to build homes for people who truly needed them. He took the bus to work. He made his own coffee. For the first time, he was living a life that was quiet and honest. One Tuesday evening, he walked toward the familiar glass doors of the architectural firm where everything had started. He wasn't wearing a three-piece luxury suit. He wore a simple dark sweater and a pair of worn-out boots. He didn't have a team of guards behind him. He didn't have a checkbook in his pocket to buy the firm. He was just a man standing on a sidewalk, waiting for a woman he had once tried to own. When Ebony stepped out of the building, she stopped. She looked at him, and her eyes didn't fill with the anger he remembered. She saw the way his face had changed. The sharp, cold edges of the white dragon were gone. His jaw was still strong, but his expression was soft and open. He looked like he finally knew what it felt like to be human.
I heard about what you did. You gave up everything.
I didn't give up everything, Ebony. I gave up the things that were keeping me from being a real person.
Min-jun took a small breath. He didn't step into her space or try to dominate the conversation. He stayed where he was, giving her the choice to stay or walk away. I didn't give up everything, Ebony. I gave up the things that were keeping me from being a real person. I realized that you can't build anything meaningful on a foundation of lies. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a diamond ring. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a simple sketch of a garden he was planning for the housing project. It was a new blueprint, one built for the community, not for profit. I'm not here as a boss, and I'm definitely not a billionaire anymore. I'm just a man who realized that the first chapters of his life were written by a monster. Ebony looked at the sketch, then back at him. She saw the raw honesty in his eyes. He wasn't asking for a merger or a trophy. He was asking for something much harder to give. I want to start over, Min-jun whispered. Not from where we left off, but from the very beginning. I want to be someone who earns your respect, one day at a time. I'm asking for a chance to start from chapter 1. The city noise seemed to fade away as Ebony looked at him. She didn't say yes, and she didn't say no, but she didn't walk away. She took the sketch from his hand, her fingers brushing against his. The reset was complete. As they stood there under the evening sky, the old story was finished, and for the first time, they were both holding the pen to write what came next.